By then, Byrd had completed 2 successful trips to Antarctica. He was well on his way to being considered a legendary explorer.
He was the first person to fly across the South Pole.
For nearly a century, Antarctica's most dangerous secret lay frozen beneath the ice, guarded by silence and erased from history. In 2023, the last man alive from Admiral Byrd's most mysterious expedition finally spoke.
One time a person asked me, said, would you like to go back to the Antarctic? I told him, what do you think? I'm in Florida, where it's warm here.
Robert Johnson's confession was not theory or rumor. It was a first-hand account of something extraordinary, something governments buried for generations. Now, the truth he carried for almost 80 years can no longer be hidden. The legend of Admiral Byrd, Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd, was not just a man in uniform. He was an idea, a living emblem of the early 20th century's hunger for discovery. His name first reached national headlines in 1926 when he claimed to have flown over the North Pole. Whether every detail of that flight was exact did not matter to the public. They wanted heroes, and Byrd fit the image perfectly. He wore the Medal of Honor with quiet pride, spoke with precision and authority, and carried himself with the calm of a man who had faced the worst nature could throw at him and returned with the story. He moved effortlessly between worlds.
But after 150 miles, we were turned back by a storm. We were dodging icebergs and thick weather on the way back.
One day, he would be in the halls of government, briefing politicians on the importance of polar research. The next, he would be in a lecture hall, captivating an audience with tales of blizzards, icebergs, and survival in the harshest climates. For newspapers, he was a gift. His face, framed by the fur-lined hood of an Arctic parka, sold copies. His words, printed in bold columns, stirred imaginations. But those who spent enough time in his company noticed that behind the charisma was something sharper. It was not arrogance, nor was it mere ambition. It was a pull, a deep and relentless draw toward the unknown. For Byrd, exploration was not simply about planting flags or mapping coastlines. It was about pushing into places where the questions grew heavier than the answers. And nowhere did those questions feel more alive than in Antarctica. The white continent became the axis around which his professional life turned.
Sure didn't expect all this, I'll tell you. It's really something.
His first Antarctic expedition in 1928 was hailed as a triumph. He returned with detailed maps, meteorological data, and enough dramatic photographs to fill magazine spreads for months. Yet, when he spoke privately about that journey, there were moments when he stopped short, as if there were things he could not or would not describe. He had seen something that gnawed at him, and though the world only knew of his triumphs, Byrd seemed already to be thinking of going back. In the years that followed, he did just that. Each return to Antarctica was larger and more ambitious, but also more guarded. The official goals were still about science, mapping, and national prestige, but the inner workings of his expeditions shifted. The selection of personnel became more selective, the sharing of information more compartmentalized.
Johnson is the last surviving member of Admiral Byrd's expeditions to the Antarctic.
Crew members began to notice that certain discussions took place behind closed doors. Certain maps were not left out on tables. Certain details never appeared in public reports. By the late 1930s, Byrd had grown into a figure both celebrated and mysterious. To the outside world, he was still the charming adventurer. Inside the Navy, however, there was an understanding that his Antarctic work had uncovered matters that required discretion. Even in conversations with high-ranking officials, Byrd was careful, weighing his words before speaking. This was not the behavior of a man trying to protect trade secrets or scientific breakthroughs for later publication. This was the behavior of a man protecting something far heavier. Rumors began to circulate in certain military and political circles that Byrd's Antarctic findings were of strategic importance. Some whispered about the continent's vast mineral wealth, its uranium deposits, and its value in any future global conflict. Others hinted at stranger things, anomalies in navigation, magnetic oddities, and phenomena that could not be explained by geology or weather. Whether these stories were exaggerations, distortions, or reflections of the truth, one thing was certain: Byrd himself was not encouraging them, but neither was he doing much to dispel them.
A lifetime of memories from an explorer and member of our greatest generation.
He had reached a point in his career where he could choose his missions and, more importantly, choose his men. The crews he assembled for Antarctic expeditions were not random collections of eager volunteers. They were carefully filtered. Skills mattered, of course, but so did character. Byrd wanted men who could work in extreme conditions, but also men who would keep their mouths shut when told to. In this sense, the selection process became as much about loyalty as it was about expertise. This growing culture of secrecy did not go unnoticed. Some journalists grumbled that Byrd's operations were becoming harder to cover. Politicians found that their questions about certain aspects of the expeditions were met with polite but uninformative answers. The public, however, saw nothing unusual. To them, Byrd remained the man who risked his life to bring home knowledge from the edges of the world. By 1939, Byrd was preparing for yet another Antarctic mission, this one under the umbrella of the United States Antarctic Service. On paper, it was another exercise in exploration, mapping, and science. In practice, it carried a different tone. Those close to the operation noticed an unusual number of classified documents being circulated. Maps were marked in ways that hinted at specific targets of interest, but without explanation. The Navy's involvement was heavier than usual, and there were quiet meetings from which even senior personnel were excluded. What exactly Byrd hoped to find this time was unclear to most of those involved, but within the tight circle of decision-makers, there was no doubt that this mission was not just about ice and weather stations. It was about returning to something Byrd had already encountered, something that had pulled at him for over a decade. That was when the recruitment began, quietly and without public fanfare. The men selected would not know exactly what they were walking into. All they would know was that they were serving under Admiral Byrd, a man whose name alone carried the weight of adventure and authority. And for one of those men, 19-year-old Robert Johnson, the journey would begin with a question so simple and yet so loaded that it would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. What kind of truth was Byrd guarding so closely that only the right kind of man could be trusted to see it? Robert Johnson's recruitment. Robert Johnson was only 19 when the letter arrived. It bore the formal insignia of the United States Navy and carried an invitation that felt both thrilling and unsettling. He had grown up by the docks in San Diego, working on small fishing vessels, learning to read tides and wind, and moving with the rhythm of the sea. His reputation among older sailors was that of a steady hand, never reckless, never rattled. The letter summoned him to a naval facility in Norfolk, Virginia, for an interview with the man himself. Johnson expected a panel of officers or a series of drills to test his seamanship. Instead, he was led into a small room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a single lamp casting its light in a tight circle. Admiral Richard Byrd sat at the far side, his uniform immaculate, his eyes sharp and unreadable. For a moment, neither man spoke. Byrd studied Johnson the way a man studies a tool he might need in a storm, not just looking for quality, but for reliability under pressure. Then, in a voice that carried both authority and weight, Byrd asked, "Can you keep a secret?" Johnson hesitated only long enough to take a breath. "Yes, sir." Byrd nodded, as if that was the only answer that mattered. There were no questions about knots, navigation, or survival skills. The interview ended with a brief handshake and a set of orders. Johnson left the room more puzzled than when he had entered, but also aware that something about this mission was different. It was not about what he could do. It was about what he could keep to himself. Over the following weeks, the rest of the crew assembled. Johnson began to notice a pattern. Many were young, but none were brash. They spoke little about their past service. When they asked about the mission, they received answers that were vague but firm. They were to assist Admiral Byrd in an important operation in Antarctica. No further details were necessary. There was a quiet current of unease in the air. Johnson overheard older sailors muttering that Byrd's expeditions were not like other voyages, that the Admiral had seen things in the ice that no man should have to explain, that he handpicked his crews not only for skill, but for silence. When the day came to depart, Johnson boarded with a mix of pride and curiosity. Whatever lay ahead would take him to the farthest place on Earth, under the command of a man whose reputation for bravery was matched only by the mysteries that surrounded him. He could not have known that the question Byrd asked him in that dimly lit office would become the defining line of his life, the point at which he stepped from the known world into the unknown. What kind of secret could require a lifetime of silence? Arrival in Antarctica. The first sight of Antarctica was unlike anything Robert Johnson had ever imagined. The horizon was not a clean line, but a jagged wall of ice, rising like the edge of another world. The air itself felt foreign, thin, biting, and so dry it seemed to pull the moisture from his lungs. Every breath came with a sharp chill that cut deeper than the coldest night back home. From the deck of the ship, he watched as the icebergs drifted past, some the size of buildings, others carved into shapes so precise they looked sculpted. Light played tricks on the eyes here. The sun, hanging low in the sky, cast long, strange shadows across the ice. The reflection from the frozen ground was blinding, and the world seemed caught in an endless day. When they landed, the silence was the first thing that struck him. There was no hum of insects, no rustle of trees, no distant voices, only the sound of boots crunching on snow and the wind sweeping across the open plains. That wind carried a low, almost constant tone, a whistle that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The base was a cluster of tents and prefabricated huts, standing against the immensity of the frozen landscape. Inside, the air was warmer but thick with the smell of fuel and canvas. Maps were pinned to the walls, many marked with red circles and coordinates that Johnson didn't recognize. Some of the marks had been drawn over again and again, as though someone was trying to get them just right. It wasn't long before Johnson began to notice the oddities. Compasses occasionally spun without reason. In certain spots near the base, the ice glowed faintly, almost as if lit from below. No one spoke about it, and when Johnson asked a fellow sailor about the strange light, the man only shrugged and said, "We don't ask." The nights brought their own unease. The aurora australis painted the sky in shifting ribbons of green and violet, moving in ways that felt almost deliberate, like signals from an unseen hand. Sometimes the colors would freeze mid-dance, holding their shapes far longer than seemed natural. Johnson could not shake the feeling that the land was watching them, that the ice itself carried an awareness. Then came the first sound from beneath the surface. Late one night, as Johnson lay in his bunk, a deep vibration traveled up through the frozen ground and into the walls of the hut. It was not the sharp crack of breaking ice, but something slower, heavier, and rhythmic, like the movement of something vast beneath their feet. Antarctica was supposed to be empty, but here it felt anything but. Operation High Jump. By early 1947, the operation had grown into something far beyond the scale Johnson had expected. Officially called Operation High Jump, it involved over 4,000 men, a fleet of ships, and aircraft equipped for the harshest conditions on Earth. On paper, it was a scientific mission to map the Antarctic coastline, test equipment in extreme cold, and establish a research presence. In practice, the orders were layered, and not everyone was privy to the same information. Johnson noticed early that some crews moved in tight, closed groups, answering only to officers who rarely mingled with the rest of the men. Planes flew missions whose flight plans were never posted on the common boards. When those aircraft returned, their pilots looked worn and pale, as if they had been somewhere far stranger than the official charts suggested. The first real sign that something was wrong came during an aerial reconnaissance run. Johnson was not part of the flight crew, but word spread quickly after the plane landed. The crew claimed to have seen an expanse of land far inland where the ice abruptly gave way to open water and patches of green. It was impossible. No one had ever documented such a place at that latitude, yet their voices carried the weight of men describing something they could not unsee. The following days only deepened the unease. Patrols were sent out to certain marked coordinates without explanation. Some returned hours later with nothing to report. Others stayed out for days, and when they came back, the men spoke less than before, their eyes distant, their manner changed. One man who had been cheerful since the beginning of the mission now spent his nights staring at the tent wall, flinching at sounds only he seemed to hear. The weather, too, began to defy expectations. Wind patterns shifted abruptly, Temperatures rose and fell by 20 degrees within hours. The auroras grew brighter, at times so vivid they lit the ground as if it were day. On one such night, Johnson thought he saw faint shapes moving across the horizon, too slow to be aircraft, too large to be men. When he mentioned it to another sailor, the man only gave a half smile and walked away without a word. Byrd remained a constant but distant presence. He issued orders in clipped tones, reviewed reports in private, and rarely explained his reasoning. Yet his urgency was clear. The operation was moving towards something specific, though no one outside his inner circle knew exactly what. It was on the morning of the 12th week that Johnson was ordered to join a small overland team heading toward a sector marked on the maps with a single red circle. No explanation was given, but the message was clear. They were heading into territory that had drawn Byrd's attention from the very start. What lay inside that circle was about to change everything. The fissure. The journey to the marked sector was brutal. Johnson and the small team traveled by tracked vehicles, crawling over endless fields of ice under skies that seemed to press down on them. The wind was constant, scouring the exposed skin of their faces until it burned. Each night they camped in the shadow of ice ridges, their tents rattling like paper in the gusts. The cold was a living thing, creeping through layers of fabric and settling into the bone. After 4 days, the terrain began to change. The flat expanse broke into fractured ridges, and deep cracks split the surface. It was in this landscape that they saw it, a fissure in the ice, wider than a city street, its edges glowing faintly in the low light. The air above it shimmered, as if heat were rising from the depths, though the temperature was far below freezing. Byrd's second in command ordered the team to secure ropes and descend. Johnson volunteered. The moment he crossed the edge and began lowering himself into the fissure, the sound hit him, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through his chest. It was not mechanical, yet it carried a rhythm, almost like a pulse. The walls of the fissure were smooth in places, carved into unnatural curves. As they descended, pockets of warm air brushed past his face, carrying scents that had no place in Antarctica. Earthy, damp, almost like a forest after rain. At the bottom, the ice gave way to a cavern floor of dark, polished stone. What lay beyond was something Johnson would never fully describe. Later, he would only say that it was not empty, that the space had been shaped with intent, and that the walls carried markings no one on the team recognized. They found no signs of recent life, yet the place felt awake, as if aware of their presence. Byrd examined the walls in silence, running his gloved fingers over the carvings. He spoke quietly to his officers, too far away for Johnson to hear. Then came the order to take photographs and sketches before returning to the surface. The journey back to base was even quieter than the approach. No one discussed what they had seen, and when they returned, Byrd issued orders to seal the fissure on all official maps. Reports were rewritten before being sent to Washington. Johnson understood then that this was the secret he had been chosen to guard, something that existed in defiance of everything science and geography claimed to know about Antarctica. It was not a place meant for the world to see. Robert Johnson kept Byrd's secret for nearly 8 decades. Only in his final days, at the age of 102, did he speak openly of the fissure, the hum, and the markings deep beneath the ice. His words reignited debates about what truly lies hidden in the frozen continent, and whether the Antarctic Treaty was as much about keeping nations out as it was about protecting the land. If Johnson's story is true, then Antarctica is more than ice and rock. It may be a vault, and we may not be ready for what it holds. What do you think Byrd found beneath the ice? Was Johnson telling the truth, or is the real story still buried where no one dares to look? If you want more deep dive mysteries like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next untold story from history's hidden edges.